Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon to the war. And without him, all this killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. But his orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.
Sego, it is December 1st, and I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We look back at our glorious and our grave history. A tough look at where we are now, where we are at now, and a look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanaga. You can find us, or you can find our audio streaming at www.ltnradionet.com. And of course, we are streaming live here on Facebook Live, so you can catch the show, the audio and the video of the show, if you follow us on our Facebook group page. We share that this Facebook streaming. We post it up on our Let's Talk Native Facebook group page, but we share it on a bunch of other group pages, and my wife shares it as well. So you can you'll find it in a bunch of locations, and it all leads you right back here to the Seneca territory of Cattaraugus. I'm John Kane. I am your show's host and producer, and I'm joined in studio by Jake Proud, who is running the board and running the cameras for our Facebook live stream and for capturing the video for our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. And there you can find also crystal clear video of the program and other videos that we have shot, previous shows, and previous commentaries that we have produced for a number of issues. So, again, subscribe to our channel. It is Let's Talk Native TV, and then you'll get notifications when we post a new video, and you'll be sure not to miss anything. So, by all means, check that out. All right, I got a few things I want to reiterate a little bit, and I got to spend a few more moments on the code talker issue. I'm not going to even go through the whole Trump and the moronic comments made by this guy, other than to say and ask the question: why do who looks after these guys? The code talkers I'm talking about. These are very old men, and obviously although they are a group and they're a bit of an organization, they must have somebody advising them. And it begs the question, why would anybody allow our elders to be exploited in the way that Donald Trump did last week? And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump, because keep in mind, some of these same guys were flown to a Washington Redskins game. Was it last year or the year before? And of course, they got all of the, all of the merch from, from the football game. They got the nice Washington Redskins jacket, and they got the Redskins hats, and they got all the other Redskins paraphernalia. And of course, they were paraded in front of cameras just to make a mockery out of all of us, and all of those people who are out there saying, we should be getting rid of these mascots. And so what does Dan Snyder do? He sends a plane out, picks up a bunch of these Navajo code talkers, and uses them. So my question is, and I know people are going to try to justify this any number of ways. Who is advising these guys? Who is suggesting that this is a good idea? Now, look, I realize that these guys are old, and there's probably not a whole lot of special things coming their way. But this ends up being a conversation that we all need to have. And I'll tell you, as a Native activist, when I get asked the question to explain why there is such contradiction in Native identity, why does that exist? I don't have a good answer. I mean, so when somebody asks me, why do Native people enlist in the military at a high rate? Considering everything the military did, has done, and in many ways continues to do, and not just the military, the United States in general, why would Native people enlist to serve for their oppressors? Now, there's a whole lot of reasons people throw out there. Oh, yeah, it's because Native people need to fulfill that warrior need. And that's just bull. A soldier is not a warrior. A soldier is a pawn. A soldier is demoralized. They're broken down in basic training, so they can do the bidding of superior officers. They're not decision makers. Although there are decisions that are made on the fly, there's no question about that, and many of them bad, and we're going to talk about some of those. But I just have to ask the question: why does anybody think this is a good idea, allowing rich white men to parade these guys around? I mean, when Donald Trump brought these guys into the White House, it was no accident that they posed for pictures beneath Andrew Jackson. That was intentional. I mean, it's an intentional degrading of Native people to have their photos taken under the portrait of Andrew Jackson. I mean, without even getting into the Pocahontas, Elizabeth Warren, ridiculous stuff that he talked about. The whole idea that this guy who has a history of bad-mouthing Native people. Remember Donald Trump a few years ago, a couple of decades ago, when he was getting his butt kicked in trying to be a casino mogul? Remember him testifying in congressional hearings saying, well, they don't look Indian to me. I mean, this is a guy who has done nothing but insult Native people through his entire career. So then he brings these guys in, parades them in front of the Andrew Jackson portrait, and then hurls insults at Elizabeth Warren by mockingly calling her Pocahontas. Somebody posted a Facebook picture today, and it showed Donald Trump doing some sort of ceremony or greeting of Jewish people under a Hitler portrait. Now, the only thing that would have made this even more like what he did with these code talkers would be as if he somehow made some offhanded reference or reference to some Jewish imposter calling her or him Anne Frank, because Anne Frank was an abused little Jewish girl, which is what Pocahontas was. But the idea that somebody, I mean, these are somebody's grandfathers. Who thinks it's a good idea to let a moron like Trump use these guys for a photo op, or a moron like Dan Snyder? I mean, to me, it's embarrassing. And I know everybody said, oh, yeah, those guys carried themselves with dignity. No, they didn't. They didn't. They look like pitiful old men being made fools of. And if you're offended by me saying this, then I'm sorry. Then why was it? Why has this been an issue in the news for a freaking week? It isn't because they look so good on camera. It's because the moron in chief made fools of them. And my question is, why do we do this? Why do we feel like we got to suck up to the guy in the White House? I mean, these black athletes are saying, no, forget it. I don't need to go there and be honored by the president. I don't care if I won a football game or a football championship or a basketball championship or a baseball championship. No, I'm not interested. But no, let the Native people who have been abused by this federal government, by this government more than any other people, or certainly as much as any other people, and our people just show up there. They just show up eager as a bunch of little puppies. When L. Frank Baum, when he wrote his genocide editorials, he referred to Native people as a pack of whining cur that licks the hand that smites them. When you show up in the White House to be greeted by Donald Trump, you are licking the hand that smites you. I mean, I don't agree with L. Frank Baum's genocide editorials, but that line just hangs with me. And every time I see our people sucking up to a politician, whether it's a governor or a congressman or a senator or the president of the United States or an NFL football owner, all I can think is that those people think very little of us. They despise us. They mock us. Donald Trump mocked Native people right with the code talkers in the freaking room, for crying out loud. So my question is, why do we keep doing this? Why do we lick the hand that smites us? Because that's exactly what these guys do. So you know what? I'm not just saying shame on the code talkers. I'm saying shame on the people who are going to continue to say that this is a good thing for them to do. And to continue to justify them going to these events. If those men were worth their salt, and again, I know they're old, and I'm not trying to, put a high standard for these guys or a high bar for these guys, but one of those guys should have had enough, enough going on to say, this is really an insult to be here underneath the portrait of Andrew Jackson. And they should have been sharp enough to make a comment, to offer some retort to Donald Trump's sarcasm, his mocking of Native people. And if not, then the people who brought them into the room, somebody should have said, you know what, we're not going to stand for this, and take those men out of there. That would have been something, and then people are going to wonder why take a knee for the national anthem? Why protest? Why protest the treatment of Native people? I mean, that was deplorable, folks. And again, shame on the folks who want to keep justifying these old men being dragged out for white people to take pictures of. This is like, like Geronimo being paraded out so they could, for a presidential inauguration while he was, locked up, or Sitting Bull, or any of these guys. Those are not the highlights of these people's career. And you know what? I hope that those men, and it's not just Navajo. I mean there's Mohawk code talkers. There's a bunch of people who were exploited for this purpose. I hope every one of those men had something more meaningful in their life than the time they spent in the military serving the United States war machine. I hope they did. I know some of them are pretty notorious. Peter McDonald. Yeah, he's infamous on his own right, not because of being a code talker, but for a guy who's embezzled money from his own tribe and got convicted both in a tribal court and a federal court. But we're going to keep propping him up like he's a hero. Well, he might have been a hero to the United States, but he wasn't a hero to his own people. So I don't know. I just feel like I had to offer some additional commentary on, and I'm not saying it because I hate the code talkers or I hate veterans, but in this situation, this is not the first time these guys have been paraded out for photo ops for a president, and it certainly isn't the first time that they've been made a mockery of, and yet we still keep letting them do it. We still keep letting them do it. All right, let me move on. All right, I did a screening of Rumble out in Long Island, out in Huntington at the Cinema Arts Center on Wednesday night, and it was great. It was a really good event, and I got to tell you, it's the first time I've seen the entire film. And there was one thing that struck me. There's a lot of things that struck me in the film. The film is really good, and I recommend it highly to watch it. But there was something that was mentioned in there, and something that I've overlooked over the years. And part of it was about explaining why there's such a connection between black people and Native people, race mixing and all of that. And what was pointed out is that a slave ship from Africa, they didn't send women. They only sent men. So think about that. All those slave ships from Africa did not have women in them. So who did the now? Africans weren't the only slaves. Native people were enslaved too. We just didn't work out very well as slaves. It wasn't. It was hard to keep the people who had knowledge of the land and the lay of the land and that kind of stuff. The most successful attempts at making native people into slaves was when they took the men from the area and sent them out to the Caribbean, so they could work in a place they couldn't escape, or in a landscape they were unfamiliar with. But they still kept native women as slaves. Again, it was the men they sent out to the Caribbean. So these black slaves, these black captives who were brought from Africa, they didn't have black women to breed with. For the most part, they were breeding with native slaves, women. So when it is suggested that some 85% or 80% of African Americans believe they have native ancestry, it's probably true. Because, the slave trade, in terms of the influx of slaves coming in from Africa, that didn't last through the whole slave trade. At the height of slavery in the United States, almost all of the slaves in the United States in the 1860s were born in the United States. They weren't, that slave trade had already died off in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. Now it was all domestic. It was breeding people in captivity. So it was interesting that it was brought up in the film, and it struck me, and it stuck with me. So I mean, it's kind of made me think about that a little bit more, and understanding, there's a lot of complicated issues that went on during that whole time period, especially when states were outlawing Native people for even identifying themselves as Native people, because they said, no, we drove you all out of this state of North Carolina or South Carolina, so you are either black or you're white, and you've got way too much color to be white, so you're black. Many Native people were forced to be to identify as black people, because even if they were 3/4 Native and only 1/4 black, that's what they were being designated to. And again, it has to do with the history of that racism. Now, interesting, I mentioned 1860s. Another thing I got to talk about, and I'm going to talk at length, and maybe I'll save that for the second half of the show. But Wednesday was the 153rd anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre. Yeah, 1864. Colonel Chivington, who was he was a Methodist priest. He was a Methodist minister. And this is, this is what this guy was responsible for. It's incredible. It's incredible. And I'm going to talk about that more so in the second half of the show. But I did want to, one of the other things that came out of the Rumble screening, I do a Q&A when I screen films. And usually I introduce the film, and then we talk about things in general. And somebody came up to me who wants to do a little bit of a research project, and she asked me the question. She says, "So what do Native people want?" And I was taken aback a little bit because I didn't quite fully understand the question. She goes, "I know it's hard to come up with one, with a general answer, but what do Native people want in terms of, what action would they like to see happen to address the atrocities?" And of course I said, "Well, okay, now I understand what you mean." And there's no question that reparations is one of the things that gets put on the table. Just like reparations over slavery and so many other things the United States has been guilty of, in the internment camps for the Japanese after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, all of that stuff. So there are a fair number of people who think that the United States owes reparations for the atrocities committed against Native people. And of course, there's also land claims issues. Tremendous amount of land claim issues. I mean, the United States broke every treaty it ever signed, and in the breaking of those treaties, most of those treaties were some sort of land theft in of themselves, and yet those weren't enough. They had to break those to defraud more land out of people. The whole Dawes Act thing, the whole idea of allotment, most people don't realize when you had these large swaths of native territory left, even though they were a small portion of what they native people originally held, the Allotment Act was about doing a head count and saying, well, rather than us accepting you holding this land in common anymore, we're going to divide up your territory into lots for every individual native person alive at the time. And it'll be 120 acres or 200. I mean, some of it was pretty substantial because this was this was the vast territories of the United States that the United States was claiming. So they would allot the land, and depending on the population and whether they got an accurate head count or not, there would be lots of land left over. So after allotting every enrolled member of a certain tribe with a parcel of land, 120 acres or whatever else, what was left over, the United States would sell out to to white land speculators, and that was the way the land would be diminished even farther. And of course, once lands were allotted, then no longer. I mean, it got to that point after that that white individuals could approach a native landowner and take out a lien against their property, and that's how so many native territories are what we call checkerboarded. Some of those allotments were lost through bad lending and through debt accumulation, and the debt accumulation was intentional too. Right back to Thomas Jefferson, who once recommended that business should be done with these people, and credit should be offered, and debt should be encouraged amongst the fine and influential amongst the native people, because when that debt gets too big to handle, they'll lop it off with their land. That's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. But so there are a lot of people who think that the land claim should be an issue that should be on the table and proper addressing of land. And of course, there are still many native territories or native peoples who are trying to become federally recognized, even though they have treaties that you would think international treaties that would justify and substantiate recognition by the federal government. What the United States has done is they turned federal recognition into something that is more about subjugation than recognition. In fact, their definition of FedRec is a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. So many native peoples who have histories of of treaty making and an unquestionable ancestry to the land are not recognized by the federal government as indigenous peoples. So I mean that's also one of the issues. But my answer was truth. We oftentimes we hear about on the Canadian side, especially, these things called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I don't even know about the reconciliation stuff, and I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be any. But I think before you can even talk about reconciliation, we have to have truth. And the fact of the matter is, there isn't any. I mean, this Pocahontas thing just highlights again how mischaracterized Native people are in American history, because we are considered part of America's history. Our history, our telling of our history, is not given any consideration. I've spoken in schools, in the Buffalo School District. I've got, and I opened up the book, and it still says in their textbooks, and this is junior high, 7th and 8th grade, it still says in their textbook, and there's still images all over the internet that show Pocahontas laying her head down to keep John Smith from being executed. That never happened. It never happened. It was made up. It was a BS story made up by John Smith years later. So why would John Smith make it? Well, first off, John Smith kept a journal while he was in Jamestown. Many of these guys did. There's never a mention of this incident in John Smith's own journal. At the time that this would have happened, or would have had to happen in terms of the age of Pocahontas, she would have been like 8 years old. All right, so picture an 8-year-old laying her head down to prevent some hairy white man from being executed by her father and grandfather. Yeah, that's gonna happen. That's really gonna happen. But see, what happened was she was kidnapped and held hostage. They kept negotiating the ransom that the British wanted for her was the release of British captives, and they were released, but they still kept her anyway. They kept her as leverage. They kept her under the threat of her own death to force peace, to extort, to terrorize the Powhatan Confederacy. Then she was forced to marry an old white man who wasn't John Smith, by the way. There's nothing to suggest there was any, I don't care how many times Disney says it, there was nothing to suggest that there was some sort of romantic interlude between the 8-year-old Pocahontas and the 30 or 40-year-old John Smith. No, didn't happen. But when she was held as a prisoner for all those years, she ultimately was forced to marry a tobacco baron by the name of John Rolfe. And of course, she married, and then she went back to, had her culture stripped from her. They dressed her up as a white woman, and they changed her name. She wasn't Pocahontas when she died. She was Lady Rebecca. They took her back to Europe. She got sick and she died. I think bore one child. That is the ugly story of Pocahontas. But that's not what they tell in history books. So when I'm asked the question, what do you want? I want the truth. Tell the truth. It's written. It's well documented. You can find the truth. It's not a hard research project. There are many books out there. And you know what? Written by white men. James Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me. Take a look at it. And there are plenty of books out there. There's great books written by Native people, too. So, there's plenty of research material out there to tell the truth. But instead of banning those books, like the truth about Columbus, or rethinking Columbus, and some of these other things, how about telling some truth? That was my answer. I'm not saying it's the only answer, but it was my answer. All right, we're gonna take a break. When we come back, we're gonna tell some truth. We're gonna talk about the Sand Creek Massacre, because I think people need to know what transpired here and know some truth, not written by Native people. Again, this is the thing we're always accused. Oh, you guys are twisting the facts. I'm going to read you some quotes from some of the people who testified in the congressional hearings after the Sand Creek Massacre, so you can hear what white people were saying about this, this victorious battle. We'll do that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
This old, that's old. Splash goes the paddle. Never gonna let you go. Never gonna let you go. The house is full with diamonds and gold. Never gonna let you go. Never gonna let you go. And go. In the tides, man, he's a coming. 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 Yeah. and the tax.
All right, that's a Taxman by Logan Stats, and that's the other thing we're always battling. So I guess some truth about history and some truth about jurisdiction, including what that Taxman has the right to do, is something else I guess we could talk about. Hey, look, I want to give a shout out to my sponsors, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and my good friends who not only listen to the program, but sometimes participate in the program, Ed Schindler, Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring, Sugar Montour, and the Seneca Nation. I thank you guys for continuing to support the work that I do, and that includes this show, and of course that also includes the shows that I do in New York and the events that I do in New York. So without your support, I couldn't do that. But I also want to mention and give thanks to those folks who have helped me in the past. We are in our 8th year, and we couldn't have made it this long if I didn't have advertisers and sponsors and donors over the years, especially when we were on commercial radio. So I want to thank all of you who have supported the program and have helped me be able to educate, entertain, and inform all these years. And I want to thank you for joining in the fight and doing your part. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. And thank, as I mentioned at the top of the show, CKWE for both the simulcast and the rebroadcast, as well as Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. And, of course, any of you who share my programs, and I know many of you do, none more than my wife, so I want to give my wife a shout-out also for sharing the program and helping gain or provide access to more people who are on some of these native sites, native group pages, to see, to hear something different. The thing about what I try to do here is, and I know that I'm oftentimes not necessarily offering the widest held views on some of these issues, but it's a view that warrants a conversation and perhaps give some thoughts. I mean, my comments about the code talkers. I know there are certain things that seem like taboo that you're not supposed to be able to talk about. Well, I don't know about whether it's really taboo or not. I think all of this stuff warrants a conversation, and I think revisiting history, even ugly history, or maybe even perhaps especially ugly history, is important to visit. So that's what we do here, and I think it is important that we do that. Hey, before I get back into a couple of things, I want to wish my daughter a happy 35th birthday. It was actually on Tuesday, so I want to wish Jamie Kane Hakes happy birthday. The only thing I want to mention is it sounds like Trump's man Michael Flynn has pled guilty, and that's going to be interesting to see how that pled guilty to lying to federal authorities, and apparently he's rolling over on Trump, so that's going to be interesting to see what happens. That. All right, now I want to get into it. I want to talk. No, I guess one other thing I want to mention. I did do the Vince Anello show on WJJL up in Niagara Falls on Tuesday as well, and I don't have the audio available yet. When I do, I think it's important that people check it out. I did mix it up with a couple of callers, and part of the issue with those callers is that many of them just don't know. I mean, for me to explain to a resident of Niagara Falls that it's simply illegal for the state to try to tax native gaming is something that some of these guys just can't wrap their heads around. Well, we just won't call it a tax. No, there's a test. There's a standard. So you can't just not call it a tax and treat it as a tax. Niagara Falls has been treating the revenue they've gotten from the state via or from Seneca Nation via the state as revenue, as anticipated revenue, and the state comptroller Tom DiNapoli said you can't do that. There's a standard, and the standard is simple. It says that the only way revenue sharing can exist in terms of an agreement where there is a quid pro quo, where there's a this for that. The only way that can happen is if the state provides something of value. And that something of value has to be something that is close to the value of the money that they receive. So what the federal government says that in order for revenue sharing to be legal under the terms of IGRA, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, the concession by the state for revenue sharing has to be both substantial and quantifiable. So for all of those folks, all you folks in Buffalo and Niagara Falls, or even in the city of Salamanca who say, you know, those Senecas should just pay us because we let them do a casino. Sorry, you're just wrong. I mean, this isn't my opinion. That's just not factually correct. You can't extort money out of native gaming. It's illegal. You know, and that's why I think some of the truth that needs to come out and the history has to be properly accounted for. Because when history is not properly told, it repeats itself. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes even when it is properly told, it repeats itself. But it is more likely to repeat itself when you mischaracterize it and you try to whitewash it and justify, you know, terrible behavior. There is no behavior that is more terrible, although I wish I could say that the Sand Creek Massacre was an isolated incident. It was not. It was not. What stands out about the Sand Creek Massacre was, for the first time, white people were offended in a big way about what had transpired. And so what had transpired was that this Colonel John Shivington, who was a Methodist preacher, would just savagely attack Native people and kill you know, over 400 you know, folks at the battle of, well, it's not even the battle, it's at the massacre of Sand Creek. And these were Cheyenne, and it was men, women, and children, who believed they were under the protection of the federal government at that point. But this is a classic line from Colonel John Shivington. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians, and I believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. So that's a Methodist preacher. That's a man of God. That's your Christian American. Your evangelical right from 1864. Nits make lice. You know, that expression "nits make lice" was also used by Nazi Germany when they were justifying killing Jewish children. Nits make lice. See, it didn't get talked about enough in 1864, so it would repeat itself. It would repeat itself, 80 or 90 years later. Another group of people who thought they were racially superior to a people would justify killing using any means under God's heaven. And Nazis were very Christian, by the way. Yeah, Christianity was a part of the Nazi belief system. And they believed nits made lice too. And analogized children to nits that would become the lice that an adult Jew or an adult Native person would become. But let me, without getting into what was written necessarily, I guess, in the history, I guess the bottom line, it was just a bloody massacre. But the things that were done to the people beyond just killing them and the way they were killed is what is kind of exceptional in terms of the way it has been accounted for. So here are some quotes, because there were some hearings that took place, and these were some of the testimonies. And this is from John Smith congressional testimony of Mr. John Smith, 1865. I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than ever I saw before. The women cut all to pieces with knives, scalped, their brains knocked out, children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from suckling infant to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. That's John Smith. I saw one squaw lying on the bank whose leg had been broken. A soldier came up to her with drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then left her there without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child lying beside her. That's Robert Bent, and he was a writer for the New York Tribune. That was published in the New York paper. There was one child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. And the Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was behind, following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards, draw up his rifle, and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a bitch. I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him too. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. That was Major Anthony, and that was also published in the New York Tribune. This is one that, this next one kind of sticks out, and I'll discuss why. Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The bodies of white antelope, or the body of white antelope lying solitary in the creek bed, was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose and ears and testicles, and the last for a tobacco pouch. So they cut his scrotum off to use his ball sack for a tobacco pouch. Now they did the same thing with women's breasts. They sliced them off to make pouches out of the female flesh. And they kept the ears and the fingers, and they kept them as souvenirs. They strung them. The soldiers strung them around their necks. That was in 1864. 100 years later in Vietnam, American soldiers would be doing the same thing. They'd be cutting off ears of the Viet Cong and stringing them around their necks. And in fact, during some of the war in the battles in Iraq, there were images and videos shot on cell phone of Marines urinating on the dead bodies of what they believed were Al Qaeda, just brown men urinating on them. So when I say history repeats itself, nobody's teaching about this heinous stuff that was done in 1864. So it's real easy for it to happen again in 1964. And it's also easy for it to happen in 2013. The idea of defiling an enemy. See, again, when we talk about the difference between a soldier and a warrior, soldiers are taught to dehumanize their enemy. Warriors don't go through that. That's not what a warrior does. A warrior is taught, in many ways, to respect their enemy. Not to respect them in terms of just, the fear part of respect, the fear of your own death, but understand that there's a certain nobility to the folks that you are at war with. That's not the way American troops or American soldiers are trained. They're trained to dehumanize, and that's what they did in 1864. They did it in 1764, 1864, 1964, and it's still happening today. It's still happening today. There are still U.S. soldiers, not just defiling the enemy, defiling the women, the civilian population, defiling their own women, the women who are wearing the same uniform as them. This is the world that we live in. I'm going to read one last quote from from one of the accounts of the Sand Creek Massacre, and this one is from a famous Indian killer. This is from Kit Carson, and this was the account that he gave to Colonel James Rustling. Now, Kit Carson wasn't exactly a poet, so they tried to write this in a way that would sound like his speech. This is, just to think that dog Shivington and his dirty hounds up there on Sand Creek, his men shot down squaws and blew the brains out of little innocent children. You call such soldiers Christians, do you? And the Indian savages? Where do you suppose our Heavenly Father, who made both of them and us, think of these things? I'll tell you what. I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do. And when they are hostile, I fought them, hard as any man. But I never drew a bead on a squaw or a papoose, and I despise the man who would. That's even Kit Carson. Now, the standard for a Native person being a hostile was pretty low. So even a guy who made his fame and fortune, I guess, killing Indians, was despised, or was just despised what John M. Shivington had done at the Battle of Sand Creek. And there were these hearings. There was a whole investigation, and the official word that came down. As to Colonel Shivington, your committee can hardly find a fitting term to describe his conduct. Wearing the uniform of the United States, which should be the emblem of justice and humanity, holding the important position of commander of a military district, and therefore having the honor of the government to that extent in his keeping, he deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre, which would have disgraced the various savages among those who were the victims of his cruelty. Having full knowledge of their friendly character, having himself been instrumental to some extent in placing them in their position of fancied security, he took advantage of their inapprehension and defenselessness and their condition to gratify the worst passions that ever cursed the heart of man. So this committee, they even recommended that there would be punishment. In conclusion, your committee are of the opinion that the purpose of vindicating the cause of justice and upholding the honor of the nation, prompt and energetic measures should be at once taken to remove from office those who have thus disgraced the government by whom they are employed, and to punish, as their crimes deserve, those who have been guilty of these brutal and cowardly acts. Shivington would resign his post so he would not be forced from office, and because he had resigned his post, he resigned his commission, they didn't pursue any charges against him. I suppose he just went back to being a Methodist minister after that. Nobody was punished. So even for all the bluster and all the testimony and the opinions of this committee, this congressional committee, nothing would be done. So when I do hear people suggest that reparations are in order, it's a little hard not to agree when you hear some of this stuff. But again, we get to this place where you have to ask the question, if you're not going to acknowledge this stuff, if you're not going to acknowledge that it happened, how do you ensure that it doesn't happen again? Racial tensions are as high as they've ever been. And I'll tell you, every time I've written something in one of the local newspapers, Buffalo newspapers, Niagara Falls newspapers, every comment that I put up on Facebook, there's going to be some deviant offering a real racist comment to to something that isn't meant to invoke a racist response. I try to make sure that when I offer an opinion that I have some sort of facts to back it up. But the tensions are as high as they've ever been. And I'll give some of that credit or blame to the President of the United States. This is a guy who spewed racist comments through his entire campaign, and the good folks of the United States of America voted for him anyway. Yeah, you elected this guy, and you can blame the Electoral College, and you can blame the South. Over 50% of the women, white women of the United States, voted for this guy. Over 50% of the white women. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, the racial lines that were drawn, even in getting this moron into the White House, could not be more clear. But you see, we won't talk about this stuff. We won't tell the true history of what black men went through, what women have gone through, what Native people have gone through, what any people of color have gone through. So you can hate these people and not understand the anger that some of them may have back towards you. The idea that you think that Native people or the people who have been wronged historically should just get over it and say it over and over and over again. When the President of the United States wants to parade people who were heroes in the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, because they were Marines, some of them. When he wants to parade those guys beneath a portrait of Andrew Jackson, and then you tell us to get over it? I mean, that's... You can't do both. You can't keep repeating the injury. You can't keep repeating the injury and tell us to get over it at the same time. The Battle of Sand Creek took place in 1864, but battles just like it have taken place over and over and over again before and since. And just like this one, others have had people who were disgusted by them. And just like this one, nothing's ever been done. Doesn't matter how many times a platoon or a battalion or a private contractor commits some heinous crime to the enemy, or how many times the blue forces, domestic militarized police in the United States, kill somebody. I mean, just to recap, in our special month, the National Native American Heritage Month, it started off with a 14-year-old boy, native boy, being killed by police. And it ends with this debacle of Donald Trump parading code talkers beneath the portrait of Andrew Jackson and hurling racial slurs, using the opportunity to hurl racial slurs at one of his political opponents. That's what we get for our special month. It's almost laughable in its absurdity. All right, folks, pretty much wraps it up. Look, we'll be back here on Monday, and we'll have something new for you. And look, I've been busy with doing some things back home, and I want to get back into our video studio and crank out some videos. So I do encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Let's Talk Native TV. That is the best way. If you subscribe, then you will get notifications every time we post a video. And I promise you, we will have some videos coming soon. And if I can get that audio from my Vincenello show appearance, I'll post that up on my pages as well. Things are getting a little dicey with this battle with the state, and as that ramps up, I'm going to stay on it, so you can count on me. All right, folks, we'll see you on Monday. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native.
It's a crying shame, just yourself to blame. Every morning when the sun comes up, you stand in your cage like a little pup. You wait for the man to turn the key. You step outside to greet a razor white. It's a crying shame. Late at night when all the killers are down, I hear the teardrops splashing on that concrete ground. It's a dangerous game. They cry for their own